Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. My name is Jenny Richards, and I'm very pleased to be hosting this session. The EA is a learned society and subject association which was founded in 1906 to promote, support, and celebrate the discipline of English studies. We cover all all stages of education, from primary early years through to secondary and further education, to higher education and beyond. We also cover all parts of the discipline across language, linguistics, literature, and creative writing. Events like this one are made possible by the fantastic contribution of our volunteer speakers. So thank you to today's speakers. Our members make it possible to keep these events free and open to all by paying their membership fees. If you would like to contribute to the national conversation about English and help support our discipline, please consider joining us. It costs around £1 per week to support our event and campaigning work for a whole year, and you'll get access to a range of member benefits, including online access to all our journals. Now it is my pleasure to hand over to Christopher, who will introduce our speakers and we'll hear what they have to say about living with machines. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jenny. Welcome, everybody. My name is Christopher Oge. I'm a senior lecturer in digital approaches to literature at the School of Advanced Study at the University of London. And I sit between the Institute of English Studies and the Digital Humanities Research Hub. So naturally, I'm very happy to be here to be chairing this session on a project that I have admired for a while. So I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers today. Ruth Honert is Professor of Literary History and Digital Humanities at Queen Mary University of London. And Tim Hobson is a lead research software engineer at the Alan Turing Institute. And finally, Daniel Wilson is a historian and computational humanist at the Alan Turing Institute, who works with large collections of digitized texts and images. So having done that, how about we hand over to you, Ruth, to introduce your team's work. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm just going to share a few slides. I'm going to speak for about 10 minutes and hopefully launch a couple of topics that we can then discuss in the Q&A. There we go. Thanks. Oh, my notes, of course, have gone off the screen now. Never mind. Thank you so much for having us here today. We're really excited to talk about this project. It is a completed project. It ran from 2018 to 2023, but there's still things coming out of it and ongoing initiatives. So the origin of the project goes back to a conversation between the Alan Turing Institute and the British Library back in 2017. They felt that because of their co-location, and for those of you who don't know, the Alan Turing Institute sits inside the British Library's King's Cross campus, they felt that there was a clear kind of set of complementary offerings. The British Library has been digitizing its collections for decades. It has millions of pages. And of course, the Alan Turing Institute, being the nation's Institute for AI and Data Science, has the skills to leverage that material. So conversations turned into a bid, which was submitted in early 2018. And we assembled a large team to tackle what we might call a data-driven humanities project or a humanities-focused data science project. And the kind of starting contention of the project was that the untapped depth of digital archives means that there is still much to learn about the human, social, and cultural consequences of the coming of the machine age in the long 19th century. Essentially, we had 4 key objectives. What we really wanted to do was see how we could begin marshalling the large digitized archives that we have in the UK at the moment. Money has been being spent on this for decades. What can we do right now with that? And in the process, we wanted to see if we could develop innovative computational methods, tools, and infrastructure that could be used not just by us, but by other projects. In so doing, we wanted to hopefully generate some new historical findings. But above all else, we wanted to engage in this project through an experiment in radical collaboration. So this is our large team. It's a large and diverse team. So it included historians, data scientists and research software engineers, curators and library professionals, computational linguists, an urban geographer and a literary historian. And having a project team of that kind of size and diversity takes a lot of work to turn into an active and productive collaboration. That's what we really want to talk about today. But before we do so, I want to kind of give a sense of what we were tackling. So we were working primarily with collections at the British Library, but also in other leading GLAM institutions. We were interested in newspapers, census returns, maps and books. And we were mostly working with pre-digitized content, but we also did some targeted digitization as well to fill gaps that we saw in these collections, but also to contextualize that data, as I'll speak about briefly in a moment. I'm just going to give 3 kind of case studies of things that we achieved on the project, just to kind of give you a taste of what one might do with big collections like that. So the first thing I'm going to mention is what a tool we developed to work with large map collections. The idea was that how do you search the contents of maps, especially when there isn't any kind of way of like searching text or features. So we developed a computer vision pipeline, which was designed to kind of help us find things that we were looking for. So the pipeline did this. We took our map collections, we chopped them up into patches, and then we took a section of those to train a model. And so experts in the team would go into the map and label it saying, does this patch have this feature? In this example case, does it have rail infrastructure or does it not have rail infrastructure? The pipeline would then, the computer vision neural network would then learn those patterns and make predictions. And it ran these predictions across over 30 million patches and 19,000 individual Ordnance Survey map sheets. And what we have now is a kind of a rough-grained map of rail infrastructure in the UK across the 19th century. Importantly, this is a tool that you can use not just for maps, it can be used for any kind of visual source. And what we'd really like to see is that another project called SciVision, which is a kind of a project coming out of the Alan Turing Institute working on phenotype maps, so plant phenotype maps, has also been using this tool because of its kind of general applicability. Another thing that we did on the project is we wanted to think about the trope of the living machine. And we had this hunch that large language models could help us. This was back before ChatGPT, and we were working with the state of the art then, which was BERT. And we thought that we could do something with this. So we wanted to see if we could find sentences where a reference to a machine was made, where one would normally expect reference to a human. And the idea that would point us towards anthropomorphization. So what we did was we trained a model on 60,000 19th century books to kind of get a kind of model of 19th century language. And then we fed it sentences from that collection with the word machine or other machine related words covered up and asked the model to predict what would be in that gap to see if we could surprise the model. And we found that when the model made predictions such as girl, man, boy, woman, prince, we were seeing examples of either machines being anthropomorphized or humans being referred to in ways in which you would expect a machine to be described. And so this was a method that we published, but also allowed us to write a kind of history of that trope of the living machine, which the details are at the bottom of the screen. A final thing I want to talk about that we did was really kind of probing how useful digitized collections are in terms of their representativeness. So we may have millions and millions of pages of newspapers, for example, but how representative is that of the newspapers that existed in the past? And so we developed a method for answering that question, and a kind of framework that we hope others will use. So we digitized the press directories that ran from the mid-19th century and that were published nearly yearly. And we used that as a way of kind of creating a map of most of the newspapers that existed each year, and then matching our digitized corpus of newspapers against those titles. And this not only told us what kind of coverage we have in our digitized corpora, but it also allows us to tell us something about the nature of those, because in these press directories, they were published with information such as the political leaning, the price, the geographical coverage, which allowed us to do analyses saying, actually, our corpus, for example, oversamples conservative titles or slightly leans towards elite voices. And this is a really important contextualization for any kind of analysis we're doing using a digitized content. We need to understand the context of how representative our collections really are. So it's all very well talking about where we got and the cool things we were able to do, but how do you get there? And that's what we really want to talk about today. So if we return our thoughts to the start line, what it was like starting this project, it was actually really difficult to get it going. We were beginning from a standing start in 2018. We hadn't got any pilot projects. There was almost no prior inter-team collaborations. And indeed, some of our team members had never worked on collaborative projects, especially the historians. We hadn't actually acquired the data. And there was also the legal processes you need to get hold of data are very complex. And we hadn't actually got the infrastructure in place. So all of those things had to be done at the beginning of the project. We needed to create a team, a sense of shared vision, and do all of those practical things together in quite short order in order to deliver on our research. And that is exacerbated when you're amassing a team from many different disciplinary backgrounds. What a curator might think of as a success story is really different from what an English studies person might think of as a success story, or a research software engineer or data scientist. And they also have really different ways of working. In our discipline of English, we are quite used to just disappearing off to a library for possibly many years to write a book, and it's a very solo process. Whereas a research software engineer might work in 2-week sprints, delivering very time-bounded deliverables and reporting as part of a team. And that kind of has ramifications for how we ascribe credit and authorship on a project. And that was something we had to think really carefully about. And so we didn't have many models to look to about how you do a project like this. So we had to think very carefully about how you create a team. And so I'm going to suggest a few things that were important to us that I'd like us to kind of expand on in the Q&A. So I'm just going to say a few more sentences, then draw to a close. So the first thing I think is really important is creating a shared vision for the team. And we did that through a project charter, which set out our shared values and principles. And we revisited it through the project. And I would really strongly encourage people to do something like this on a project. We also wanted to create shared understanding on the team and to co-generate ideas. So we had something that we called the hypothesis generation group, which was essentially a bunch of us all getting together, research software engineers reading bits of historiography with the curators and the historians and the literary historians, all of us together, in order to think about hypotheses we were interested in that were not only historically interesting, but also interesting from a technical perspective. Another thing that we did to actually get the research process going was we developed a concept of the minimum research outcome. So essentially a proof of concept project within the projects where we could try out our ideas on a kind of short time-bounded basis. And it kind of borrows ideas from software development, the idea of the minimum viable product, and how that allowed us to try something and decide whether it's worth pursuing longer within the project. Finally, oh no, not finally, but we also valued the process of enhancing our skills and sharing knowledge through learning to code together. So we would have all of these different spaces in which we could kind of share material. We shared our best practices in using GitHub, which is a place where people can share and develop code collaboratively, but also provided informal support and reviewing one another's code, so that we could work iteratively together. And Tim will speak a little bit more to that. And finally, I'd like to speak briefly about what all of that means for how we author things. Traditionally in English, we might have we might be solo authored. We might have 2 authors on something. We might co-edit something together, not involve 2 or 3 people. But in the sciences, we have they have a different model of authorship, long author lists, and different ways of crediting work. And so we had to wrangle with that, how we ensured that all people on the project and all the different kinds of labor were fully credited, and what that meant for author lists. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. I'll just round off here. This is a slide we might share again at the end. It's got some details about how you can learn more about the Living with Machines project, including our website. But I think perhaps more interestingly, our current book, which is available for open review. It's being a kind of community reviewed process. So we'll come back to that in a moment, I hope. But I'll just stop sharing and hand back over to Christopher.
Thank you so much. That was really excellent. Before I get to a question, I just want to say that a team that I was working with was personally influenced by your use of the credit taxonomy and thinking about collaboration and credit. And so the project I was working on, which was it was a pedagogical project, were influenced by what you were doing and thinking through these issues. So maybe we could talk more about that in due course. But you did address how your collaboration came about, and it seemed a bit informal in a way. Could you say more about how you can kind of keep that momentum going when you feel like you're having good conversations, but you don't quite see where it's going?
Yeah, and are you talking about kind of how the project started up, or like the early days?
Yeah.
And it's a good question. I guess, as I alluded, it was a bit of a top-down initiative in the first place. They essentially got a bunch of people in a room to say, we think the Alan Turing Institute and the British Library should collaborate. But I think, you can have CEOs with a vision. So I think we're really thankful to Sir Alan Wilson, who was the CEO of the Alan Turing Institute at that point, who was an urban geographer, but essentially was a real kind of history enthusiast. And also the vision of the British Library. We're thankful to them, but you then need people to make that suggestion a reality. And so we're really grateful to certain people for just really making that opportunity into a proper conversation. So we're really thankful to people like Maya Maricevic for saying, actually, we'd really like you to work with our newspaper collections, and this is why we're excited about them. And we're grateful to Emma Griffin and John Lawrence, who are history co-authors in the project. They had never done any collaborative work like this before. They would never describe themselves as digital humanists, but they were really up for saying, this is potentially exciting, and we would like to learn more about what we could do. And we're excited about the opportunities of working at scale. But I think one of the kind of people that really made this exciting was someone called James Hetherington, who used to be Tim's boss. He was the director of the research engineering group at the Turing. So he came on board and said, I want us to think differently about what research software engineers do and how they are seen on projects. They're often kind of treated as the muscle. You say, oh, we really need this done. Can you go away and do that? And he made the point that for a really successful project in this space, research software engineers are your equal collaborators. They have something really important intellectually to add to this vision. And so we took that, and from the very outset, we tried to design a project that allowed us to have a conversation and say, we are interested in this historical question or this literary question. How would you operationalize that? And is that interesting for you? And what's the technical payoff? So we really tried to design a project that wouldn't just feed back into history, into literary studies, into computational linguistics, but also feed back into data science, because it was thinking about new ways of technically doing these tasks. And so I think that was what was really exciting for us. We want to do something that's sort of greater than the sum of the parts. We did that by essentially trying to create a very flat structure that allowed us to listen to everybody's voices. But maybe I can hand over to Tim and Daniel to talk about actually how the rubber hit the road. How do you actually do that on a daily basis? It is a good question.
Yeah.
Maybe Daniel,
please.
maybe Daniel could talk about the hypothesis generation group.
Sure, I can say a word about that. So thanks, Ruth and Christopher. So yeah, Ruth mentioned in passing that we had a sort of group that we established quite early in the project, which had the slightly unwieldy name of Hypothesis Generation Group, which is a little bit sort of sounds a bit naive in some ways, but the idea was to, so coming into the project as a historian, my role at that point felt like a person who would try to draw connections between the existing literature, so the historiography, and some of the more sort of technical aspects of the project, data sets kind of available to us, and the tools that we use. So the idea was really to, I mean, like many people in the humanities, when you're not sure what to do, you have a reading group. So this was essentially a reading group, but it was quite carefully sort of curated and targeted to pick out quite, I guess, significant bits of reading that one of the historians, often myself, would sort of introduce, and then we'd read together with our software engineering colleagues. We would read classic bits of history, Asa Briggs talking about urban history. We would read Eric Hobsbawm on the Luddites. We'd read one of our colleagues' work, Griffin, about the Chartists. And this was really sort of as a way to kind of return to that. I mean, there was a kind of temptation to forget the kind of past 50 or 100 years of scholarship. Is the sound quality not great? Saying,
it might sound better through your laptop. I don't know, but I know that's complex because you're both in the same room.
Let me switch.
Is that better? Is that better? Okay, sorry about that.
Yeah, it is.
So I was just saying that it's easy to forget, the 50 or 100 years of scholarship that we all depend on. So we wanted to go back afresh to some of that work, even if it's 50 or 60 years old. Some of the questions and problems raised in that historiography often reached a kind of endpoint imposed by the availability of material. So we wanted to expose that material to the brains of research software engineers and other colleagues from other disciplines and see if they could sort of shed some fresh light and come up with new questions that might be possible to imagine. And often that is what happened. People who weren't from a history background would ask quite plain and intelligent questions about the historical questions. Why were they framed that way? Why didn't they consider this other feature? What if we could use this particular approach to those texts? So together we kind of worked up various hypotheses, I guess empirically testable questions about the literature that we would then try and develop into our research program. I mean, this often ended up with rooms full of kind of post-it notes and shared ideas. We would kind of rank them according to what was feasible. And the conversations were really refreshing. We would suggest a possible question. A software engineer would say, well, no, you can't really do that. That's not possible, but you could try this instead. And they might suggest something back, which we hadn't thought of, which would then make us reframe the question. So people talk a lot about iterative research and interdisciplinary collaboration, but it often doesn't amount to genuine sort of interaction in the way that I think we did experience in the group at that point. And certainly I found it a very sort of just refreshing experience going back to that literature. I mean, Tim was in the room for some of those conversations as well, so maybe he can give his perspective. But we extended it. We read novels, we read fiction, we read Elizabeth Gaskell, we read Mary Barton, we read Shirley. So we kind of really tried to get everybody on the project to develop a sort of shared vocabulary, at least a minimal shared understanding of some of the keystones in the literature in the period, from which we could then have better conversations as the project developed. So that was a bit utopian, but I think it worked. I think it did. Tim, do you want to come in on that at all?
Thanks, Daniel. I hope you can hear me. So yeah, hi everyone. So I'm a mathematician by training, and now I'm a research software engineer. So I sort of hesitate to talk about 19th century literature in a group like this, just out of obvious sort of ignorance. But I part of the reason I sort of elected to to join this project was I'm very fond of what you probably consider quite lowbrow, sort of Anthony Trollope, that sort of thing. But but I do remember like some high points from the project. Were reading Hard Times, I think was one we read, and then being able to then discuss that with people like John Lawrence and Daniel and others was really fantastic experience. I mean, the job of research software engineering demands that you can sort of drop into a new group of researchers in a domain that you're probably unfamiliar with, and that was certainly the case here. So we're kind of that's part of the job description. But even for an RSE at the Turing, this particular project presented unusual challenges and unique features. I mean, just the volume of data. Again, we're very used to working with big data, but those digitized newspapers that were running to sort of tens of terabytes and had to be just storage alone, let alone processing, and then making the data accessible to the researchers was an enormous task. But if we'd been doing that in isolation without this genuine sort of radical collaboration, it really wouldn't have worked. So we had to understand the ideas and the hypotheses that were going to be tested from the beginning. And of course, that's much more engaging if you're also able to sort of contribute to that process. And that was a particularly nice thing about this project. We really were treated as equals, despite our our obvious ignorance of at least in my case of sort of history and English language. So yeah, I mean, it was a great experience. I think the only thing I can remember from the start of the project that was the real tricky thing was the actually acquiring the data and then being able to. We knew that we were going to have to use a diverse set of data for various different applications, which hadn't all most of which hadn't actually been sort of decided on at the outset. That's quite unusual. Usually a data science project, there'll be one specific data set, and then you'll know what the plan is for that data, and then so you can plan ahead. We knew we had to be particularly agile and open to all sorts of possibilities of new directions, and that meant doing sort of the data modeling process very much in this collaborative way, and we sort of interviewed all of the researchers on the project to try to make sure that whatever digital infrastructure we eventually put in place, it would satisfy all of those competing and potentially competing, but very diverse requirements.
Should we talk briefly about the minimum research outcome? Would that be helpful?
That was going to be one of my questions, so please do.
Yeah, and well, we were doing this work on kind of generating ideas, but we then wanted to test them. But some of the tasks are really ambitious. So when you have like a really ambitious research question, how do you work out if it's going to be worth spending X number of years on? So we decided to time bound some of the tasks at the beginning of the project. So we had these labs. We had like a space lab and a time lab, and and we had these kind of very specific questions that we developed, and each of the labs developed what we called a minimum research outcome, which was a kind of, what is the smallest version of this question that you can ask? Be willing to do a kind of dirty process on it, and let's see what comes out at the end to work out if we want to spend more time on this and scale up what we find, or whether we just say that was a great experiment, we've learned this from it, and we know that we don't want to spend more time on it. So that was a really interesting process, and I don't know if anyone wants to speak about one of the examples from that, either Tim or Daniel.
Yeah, I slightly missed the start, but I think Christopher's question was about tasks or the choice of questions. Was that the? Can you hear me?
Oh, sorry. We were talking about the minimum viable product approach and how can you kind of prototype without, you know, going too far down the road of building.
I mean, I can give a quick example, and then maybe Tim can say something about how you organize that formally. But yeah, as Ruth said, it's a bit overwhelming when you begin a project of this scale because it's so open-ended. So just trying to decide where to concentrate your efforts at the start is quite important. And so yeah, as Ruth said, we divided up the project into kind of thematic labs. So yeah, space was a kind of geographical set of concerns. Time was to do with, well, temporality. We had one lab which was called the Sources Lab, which became quite big and quite important because we realized pretty quickly, and we'd always thought that the newspaper collections of the British Library would be a major set of sources for us. But as we began to formulate questions which would make use of those newspapers, it quickly became clear that there didn't exist anywhere a very good understanding of what those collections actually contain. I mean, you can enumerate the number of pages and you can say when they were digitized and by whom and how many issues of certain titles are stored. But if you want to ask anything qualitative about those newspapers and make a conclusion that's historically interesting, you need to be able to say quite a bit more about what that collection contains. And as Ruth mentioned, what it represents, what is it representative of? So before really diving into specific questions, we did a lot of preliminary work, which in some ways is still going on now, and I don't think it's finished, which is a kind of work of source criticism, where you take a collection like the British Library's newspapers and just try to actually describe the contours, and using various bits of reference material we were given access to, we were able to do this in a computational way, which allowed us and now makes it possible to say, you know, this collection contains this many liberal newspapers versus this many conservative newspapers. What proportion of which would you expect to find and in what time period? How does that composition and that ratio compare to the wider set of newspapers in circulation, of which the digitized collection is just a subset? You know, so when you go into the British Newspaper Archive, as many of you probably do, you type in the search box, you know, Ireland or suffragette, whatever it is you're searching about, it's very difficult to know from which subset of the newspaper collection your results are coming. People often assume, even experienced academics, that what they're searching in some way represents the totality of what's in newspapers, but actually it's not at all. You're probably looking at between 5 and 20% of the collection is digitized, depending on where you're searching. And of that 5 or 20%, the composition may be very different to, we call it the newspaper landscape. So quite a big piece of work developed around that question, which would sort of be preparatory for doing further research. And that became really a big job of collection history and I guess curatorial and source criticism, which we published and are still publishing on now. But through that work, you can begin to develop questions which might look at, say, the polarization of language in the newspapers across the 19th century. And you can't really say anything sensible about polarization until you know what the nature of the sample is that you're working with. So in a way, it's quite sort of, it's the kind of work that curators are normally seen as doing. But when you're working with millions and tens of millions of pages, it needs to be scaled up in ways that are technically very difficult, but also I think essential if we're going to say anything meaningful with these kind of materials. So yeah, that's one example, I think, about the newspapers. Tim, do you want to come in with a MVP?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, I mean, I can say a bit more about the kind of the MRO concept. So yeah, people have probably heard of like the idea of an MVP, a minimum viable product in software engineering, where you don't try to sort of spend a year or so or more like developing and then suddenly come up with an end product. Instead, you try to have at least something that can be demonstrated, something that works, but in a simple way within, say, a month, and then you iterate on top of that, and you release quite frequent working products until you end up with something, and that just is just a far more successful way to build software, it turns out. And so we wanted to do something, kind of used the same, in a sense, the same sort of methodology in to kickstart the project from this standing start. And I think it was James Hetherington who came up with the idea of a minimum research outcome. And yeah, I mean, it was quite structured. It was very much based on writing down testable hypotheses. And I think there was a requirement. We all sort of filled in a kind of template which asked for a historical research question as well as a historical sort of methods question. How are you going to approach the research question? But also a data science research question, because yeah, we've talked about how the software engineers were sort of equal partners. There were in the research engineering team that I'm part of. Some of us are referred to as research software engineers, but others are research data scientists. So we really are. We're sort of we're ex-researchers essentially who have ended up writing software or doing data science. So it's very much research led, the way we sort of think and work. So that collaboration or collaborative kind of stance was front and center in the way that those MROs were structured. And then also there were more technical things like, well, what infrastructure and what data are going to be needed to address the question or to make these methods work. And why is this a minimal research outcome? Don't try to do too much. We were very sort of strict about that. And a very important final question, I think, in that sort of structure was, how will the other labs benefit from the outputs from your lab? So we were really, really careful. I think Ruth deserves a lot of credit for this. The project was very careful not to allow individual labs to become sort of silos that would kind of go off and do their own thing and not contribute to a kind of greater overall outcome. And and these labs were, it's been mentioned, space and time. There was a language lab because we were working with computational linguists, and so a lot of the data scientists were interested in natural language processing, which has now become the big thing with large language models, and that's now the big sort of AI sort of bleeding edge. And I think so members of my team certainly were fortunate to have been in the right place at the right time to have all this this project focusing to some extent on natural language processing, which kind of got them into an ideal place 5 or so years ago.
Thank you. Incredibly rich answers. I'm thinking of follow-up questions that I would like to use. But I think I just want to leave this one question to you before we turn to the audience, which is, do you have any general reflections on what you learned from these collaborations, or even in hindsight, what kinds of things could have been done better now that you've finished the project?
I mean, I think you always wish you knew what you knew at the end of the project at the beginning. But I think, I mean, I think there's things that we're proud of that are research content and things that we're proud of in terms of research process. And I don't know if Daniel would like to say anything about some of the research outcomes first. I probably will finish on the kind of meta level.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really do justice to the research outcome in a sort of quick description, but one, I guess, general feature of the work we tried to do was to get different source materials of different types. So on the one hand, texts, on the one hand, it turned out maps, and then things like the census, the historical census. And we really wanted to try to see if we could, I mean, the 19th century, in British history at least, is one of the most well-worn sort of areas of research there is. That's not to say research on that period's finished and we can sort of close the book on it, but it is very difficult to find new space within that historiography to make an intervention. So we were very keen to find ways, or to ask whether, by bringing these different source types together into combination, you could ask new questions that it hadn't been possible to ask before. So that was the kind of challenge we set ourselves. And it's a slow burn. Some of the work I described previously with regard to newspapers, we repeated with regard to map collections. So we were lucky to get the National Library of Scotland's collection of OS maps to work with. And over a 2 or 3 year period, we were able to get the map collections into a place where we could ask quite new and I guess, yeah, complicated questions about the industrializing landscape, which were interesting in themselves. But when you combined the results of those questions with information from the census, you could start to ask new questions about the changing demographic patterns of the 19th century city and country, in fact. The aim of the project really was to ask what it was like to live with machines. So we were trying to get at this sort of experiential quality that, you know, all historians want to get at, but it's very hard to get at from documentary sources. So we tried to kind of imagine what it might be like to live in proximity with certain features in the landscape. Obviously, you can find testimony about those kinds of things. You can find diary entries and other forms of writing which tell you what it was like for one person to live somewhere. But we wanted to ask, what would it be like at the scale of the nation, to ask what could it be like to be affected by this industrializing landscape? And the case study we worked on primarily was the coming of the railways, which again is a literature that's quite well developed, but never before had anyone been able to ask whether the railway had really influenced the places that people chose to live across the country. So that was a question we tried to ask by combining data sets involving the maps on the one hand, information from the census about where people were moving between, and various other kind of supplementary data sets to do with things like train stations. And we've got a quite ambitious and difficult piece of work that Ruth mentioned coming out in this new book, where we bring all those materials together and have a few interesting new hypotheses about the kind of spatial effects of railway on demographic choices over time. So that work is genuinely multidisciplinary. It's quite hard to put it together. It's quite hard to describe quite quickly, but that is now online, and you can actually, I think the peer review is closed now, but it was open for public peer review. So we experimented with the new sort of publishing method. It goes online, people can make comments, and then as the authors, you respond to the comments. Together with the editors, you decide on how to proceed. So that was in itself was an interesting experience, very different to the kind of typical blind peer review you might go through, but I would say just as rigorous. And that chapter is now online. I think the link's in the chat, so you can go and read that. Piece of work's called Beyond the Tracks. So that's something that really wouldn't have been possible, and we're hoping that more work like that will be done by others as well as by ourselves. Do you want, how are we for time?
I was thinking maybe I need to just wrap up with like a reflection on the sort of meta level. Is that okay, Tim? Yeah. I was going to just kind of conclude by reflecting on, you know, what we can now do as with the experience of collaborating with people in different fields. I feel like we've all come out with almost like a foreign language phrase book, that we now are able to have fairly fluent conversations with people from very different disciplinary backgrounds, that we didn't know what we didn't know how to ask at the beginning, but now we know. And so I think it gives us all the ability to approach collaborations with a much clearer sense of how to enter into conversations and, you know, really get to the nub of the problem much quicker. And I think we've become conversant in a lot of different methods. Become generalists in some ways that are actually in ways that facilitate exchange in really nice ways. And I came in, my only kind of computational background was in like network analysis at the beginning of the project, but now I've kind of come into contact with things like computer vision and large language models. And I think it's just worth focusing on where we are at the moment in higher education, in society, with kind of the situation with AI and language models. And I think at this point, at the beginning of the project, I wouldn't have felt that I was able to kind of have an opinion on that moment. But right now, I think we do. I think that we've been through an experience of, we trained our own language models. I think we were the first project to use a language model on a historical corpus. And what that process showed us was that language models, yes, do indeed have biases, but actually sometimes when you train them on a specific historical period or community, you can actually begin to understand something very useful about the societal attitudes and biases that get embedded in cultural products. And so that's why I'm really convinced actually that having people with English degrees in the room with people developing this kind of tech is absolutely crucial, because we understand things about how archives are made. You know, you talk about training data, these are just essentially archives, and that archives are made by the people who have kind of been dominant in history, the winners of history. So we need source criticism that Daniel was talking about. And the people who know all about source criticism are people from the humanities, people from English studies. So yeah, I think that's where I would want to conclude, that we are needed at this very specific moment, and we're needed in that specific debate.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because when Daniel mentioned source criticism, I was thinking this is the antidote to a lot of the questions that are being raised in AI. But it also anticipates one of the audience questions from Madeline. How has the recent emergence of AI deep research, Gemini, ChatGPT, et cetera, challenged or enhanced the process of digital humanities research? And how did you use tools like these?
Do you want to jump in here, Daniel? Because you and Mariona kind of really came up with our use of language models as a kind of joint idea.
Yeah, I mean, I'm switching back to the other mic. I hope you can hear me okay. I'll just try and shout a bit. Yeah, in answer to that question, I mean, our project was well underway, in fact, nearly finished before ChatGPT came out. So no, we didn't really use those tools, but we definitely did use their immediate predecessors. I think it's only when you try and use this kind of tool close up that you get a proper appreciation, not just of what its affordances are, but also its limitations. Because amidst all the kind of fear that certain language models might take over certain processes, the frustration of how badly they work in certain things are quite useful sort of tempering kind of feeling to any such optimism. I mean, there's a separate question about things like pedagogy and I guess research assistance, which didn't really emerge in the project, but I think, you know, it's going to take a bit of time for subjects like English and history, for that matter, to work out how exactly they're going to position themselves in most of these things, and what the role of language is in what we do. I mean, obviously for English, it's pretty central. So the conversations need to happen, and there are no sort of pat answers to avoiding things like plagiarism, if that's the worry, or something else. I mean, our work, I think, has been quite creative in the uses we've put language models to. We've used them to probe and understand a particular corpus of texts, and I think that's been very powerful. But there's lots more to be done like that, and there's lots more experiments one could think of, and that other people are trying to do now increasingly. So, yeah, that's I think what I'd say about that. Did you want to talk about the credit taxonomy at all before we run out of time? I think you mentioned that, Chris, to go back to, or did you already?
Yeah, I did. It's a really important point, I think. I put a link in the chat, but if you want to speak more to that, that would be great, if people aren't aware of this.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I think, yeah, we'll start by saying that, you know, when you go into a project like this, you do have people with really different experiences of how you credit and what an author list looks like. You know, if you've ever read any science papers, you'll see that author lists are often 3, 10, 50, 500 people long, and that's because of the different things that are credited under an author list. So you might be credited for data wrangling, method conceptualization, data curation, any number of these, annotating data. And so one of our sort of early publications on the work that Daniel was talking about on the animate machine, our methods paper, we have a long author list and we have a cover sheet for it that kind of explains our contributions, because I don't know how many authors we have, Daniel, is it something about 10? But we are crediting the whole pipeline in the authorship model of people who've conceptualized, cleaned data, done annotations. So we really make that clear that we not only had a very inclusive model of authorship, so long author lists, but we also made sure to kind of explain exactly what people's roles were in that process. But that is a kind of very experimental approach for the humanists on the project, especially when you're thinking about hiring people at early career stages, that you are essentially having a bit of an experiment with their careers in a way, because they're going on the job market with CVs that have these long author lists and don't have these solo authored things. So we had to think really carefully about making sure that how could we think about outcomes that maybe had shorter author lists later in the project when they are historical studies building on previous methodologies and then using citation to drive credit. But we had to think all of those things through, that balance of crediting everyone but not penalizing people as they're about to go on the job market. And it was a balancing act. And we wrote policies, we discussed it endlessly because I think it is a really crucial thing, because it impacts on people's long-term careers.
Thank you for that. That's really, as I said, a really important point. Does anyone from the audience want to jump in and ask a question? If not, there is one more in the chat.
I think Isabel.
Thanks for a really fascinating session. I'm not really familiar with your methodologies, and that's why I'm here, to find out more. And I can understand that what you do enables you to ask very new and subtle questions that we haven't asked before, perhaps. But I was just thinking, what do you do with literary texts, if you do anything with them at all, maybe? And I was thinking, in terms of railways, immediately somebody like me will think of Dickens's Dombey and Son, which is sort of dominated by the railway. But an earlier kind of, or if you like, a literary critical or sort of old-fashioned way of looking at it would be to see Dombey in some ways as sort of illustrative. But what would you do with a text like Dombey, or would you not want to use it at all? Is that a question that kind of means anything to you?
I think we might want to think about how we would scale up the question. To, you know, would we have a question that we wanted to see, does that play out across a whole corpus of novels? Like if we had a whole corpus of 19th century novels, what would the general question be? Is this representative of this set of attitudes? So I think we absolutely might start with reading a single novel together and thinking about what questions does it raise for us, and what is the big question? How can we ask this question in a new way across a different number of texts, or even a different set of texts? We might say, actually, does the hypothesis from, you know, having read Dombey and Sons, what would we ask about the landscape? What might we ask about people living near railway stations? So yeah, I think that always has to be a tension, a productive tension between the individual text and this idea of big data. And in my approaches, I've always tried to begin with a question and then maybe asking it across the corpus, but I always end with the close reading. And our work on the animate machine, we developed this whole methodology of playing this game with a language model. But ultimately what Daniel and I and Mariona and others on the project were doing, we were reading individual sentences from novels and travel books to see what was happening at the level of the sentence. And then we started noticing patterns. And then we developed another method based on what we'd noticed through our process of close reading. So I think it's very much still part of how I work, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
I think close reading with computers is a good way to end this conversation. We're pretty much out of time, but I hope you'll join me in giving a virtual round of applause to our speakers from Living with Machines. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And hope to see you next time at the next English Association event.
Can't hear you, Jenny. Oh no. Lovely to see you. Bye.
Just to say, I'll thank you because Jenny obviously has lost sound, but thank you so much. It was a fabulous session. I'd heard about it. I'd heard about the project through Christopher and others. I'd also been on the other end of the University of London Press. That's how I'd heard about that experiment. And it's really great to bring the collaboration with English Association, IES, Digital Humanities, and the press together with this really interesting model of radical collaboration. Gives me great hope for the future. And I really thank you so much. Okay, see you
That's
next
really
time.
kind. Thank you so much.